very glad to be able to connect with everyone. Have been quite disappointed, in fact, by the lack of take-up of virtual capabilities over the last 2 decades or so. So it's been for a while. So very glad to see the virtual beginning to really shine in the way that I think it might in the future. The topic here today takes us to this issue of shocks, improvisation, and complexity. And I wanted to start really by emphasizing what I think is probably evident to many people in the future studies community, which is that when people's image of the future changes, it provides them with an opportunity to understand that the imaginary worlds can change, the imaginary futures that they conjure can change, and that doing so changes their perception of the present. However, in many circumstances, the mere fact that that occurs, that we're shocked by some event that changes our perceptions and our imagination, doesn't necessarily create awareness of the anticipatory systems and the role of anticipation in what we see and what we do. And that's why the challenge and the question of futures literacy seems to me to really be quite central to what we're talking about in the current context, but also, of course, as most of you know, what we've been working on and what UNESCO has been advancing over the last 7-8 years. The issue that I find most kind of urgent today is this question of making sense of the experiments that are going on around us. And I think that provides the motivation and incentive to become more futures literate. So let me unpack that a little bit and say that all of a sudden, when our idea of face-to-face meetings changes, for instance, we become able to imagine what we're doing right now, which is that hundreds of us will gather on a virtual platform in ways that we wouldn't have done a few weeks ago. This shift itself can be a way of trying to restore normalcy, trying to substitute old technologies into the new context, and trying to create simply continuity. Or it can suggest to us that indeed the way we've organized work, for instance, the way we've organized interaction can change in ways that we did not anticipate. Listening to John Sweeney in the previous session, what strikes me is how this desire, this expectation that we will be able to know the future inhibits our ability to take advantage of the experiments taking place all around us. And as many of you will know, because I've been saying it for many years, it's this projection of the probable, the future that we want to be able to bet on, that we want to be able to plan, the tomorrow that we want to impose on the future, to colonize, to use a pejorative term. That way of imagining the future, that reason for imagining the future is tremendously inhibiting. And I think that in the current context, we face an opportunity and a challenge to move much more towards a capability-based approach to understanding development and the realization of our aspirations in a specific context, in a specific history. The fragility that is being manifested by the current pandemic is, in my view, rooted in the very basic perceptions of agency and identity of the current dominant paradigms. It's something that is really fundamental to the way the society functions, and it's what creates our monoculture of globalization, of production. It's really something that alienates us in a profound way from the world that's around us. In other words, it doesn't allow us to feel that complexity is a gift, which it is, in my view. And as a result, it deprives us and impoverishes us of our relationship to the world around us. So, that's I think, an issue that's important to take into account. And maybe I'll turn over to Eva now.
Thanks for this introduction, Riel. What I'd like to go through is actually go through the tools that we use in order to develop our futures literacy. And before diving into that, I'd just like to also offer maybe a provocative thought on what the corona crisis is, which is the democratization of shocks. Meaning that right now in the Western world, and so even though you do see a map of Africa just here, I'm actually based in Paris, and we do feel this kind of idea that, wow, this is something huge, something unexpected, we don't know how to take that into account. And what I tend to observe is that African contexts that are much more exposed to that notion, to this notion of crisis, of tensions, of shocks that are much more redundant in their ecosystems, or actually invitation to thinking about complexity a little bit more. So that gift that Riel was telling us about is something that we should actually pay a closer attention to. In the labs that we organize, and especially, I will name two examples that we had fairly recently. One was on the future of the consequences of slavery. So this idea of the future of the consequences of the past. In those type of event, we had people who were both slavery experts, as well as artists and people who are just, who have a personal attachment to this kind of matters, but are not experts. And what was very telling was the humility that was imposed on the experts to actually listen in to new voices. And we do experience that futures are actually a public good by themselves, meaning that this discussion on things that are not just the past, of things that you have expert of, but things that are related to the future, to which we all share a common ignorance, actually enables us to drive conversations that goes way beyond what we used to discussing. In that sense, because of the humility invitation, or invitation to humility, there's an opportunity to creatively and provocatively think about why and how we anticipate. And this is what futures literacy is about, this capacity to actually understand how we use and why we use the future the way we do, for specific reasons, for different reasons, in different contexts, and of course, in different ways. The tools that we came up with at UNESCO were interesting in a way that they're actually flexible tools that invite context dependency to actually rise and be made more relevant, meaning that we have an introduction to plays, to games, and I'm happy that John had the opportunity to present before we did, because this notion of game and actually being much more playful with something that is actually a source of worry, a source of concern, is actually pretty interesting in terms of potential contradiction that is not quite so. In that sense, crises are not only opportunities, as Riel has mentioned, but also revelators of issues that we have in our systems. And something that I'd like for us to actually discuss maybe in the Q&A session will also be our approach to time. This notion of time not being just a linear frame, but actually time as space. So time is something that surrounds us. In order for us to actually approach issues that are usually considered as being African issues, such as the notion of development, but actually incorporate that reflection in our approach to transformation and innovation in the Western world. And so just before I close that in, just to open the floor to questions, because I'd be very keen to actually hear what you have to say or what you have in mind. I also like to give another example of how context matters when we talk about futures, things that are actually futures, futures that has effect. I'm thinking about a lab that I had facilitated recently in Libreville, on this issue of the future of Libreville with young people, and this idea of like agency, we need to do something so that Africa can stand. And I hear that a lot in an African context, and now hearing that in the Western world, I'm just thinking that there's parallels that we can make, and maybe lessons learned from this urgent, immediate, and imminent need for action that actually calls us to take a step back and actually appreciate doing as much as not doing, just to understand who we are a little bit better.
Great. So I noticed that there are questions starting to emerge. I guess the issue that we want to try and address here is, in some senses, and it's the opportunity that we've already talked about, and I think it's partly the reason that this summit also has captured people's interest and attention, is that there is an opportunity to go beyond business as usual, because it's just suggested by the circumstances. And let me just then take the first question here, which was, how do we maximize the use of data in foresight planning? Well, you know, this is the classic one, and it's been bounced around now quite a bit in the foresight community. You know, there's quite a bit of data on pandemics. And there's been lots of warnings, and there's been, for that matter, warnings about flooding in New Orleans if there was a Force 5 hurricane, etc. And there was planning about Fukushima but you know, do you think all that data and all that planning will stop surprises? Do we want to live in a universe, in a world where there are no surprises? In other words, by definition, no matter how much data, no matter how much planning you do, unless you can create a universe in which there's absolute certainty, which I don't think is the one we live in, then to a certain extent, you're trying to do something and you're staking your hopes and expectations and fundamentally your fears on something that leads precisely to the brittleness, to the kind of defensive monoculture that is currently being revealed for its lack of capacity to learn, to absorb, to be adaptive in the sense of allowing things to die and allowing things to be born. One of the things that's so striking about the current context is that a fetishism of immortality, the desire to make things last and be long-term and be certain, like pyramids in the future, creates a strong kind of predilection, bias towards legacy systems, path dependency, things that will be certain in the future. Well, what's our biggest legacy of this era going to be? Highways. We're going to be really well known for highways 5,000 years from now, because they're still going to be dealing with the concrete and the plastic, right? So if you think of you know, what's the civilization in Egypt, which was an incredible civilization, it's known for the pyramids. But I mean, is this the way to approach legacy? I think legacy is the generosity and the gifting that involves also endings. And so the issue of maximizing data in foresight for planning, from my perspective, in fact, that desire, no matter, I mean, it's obviously a good thing to do, and it can be done within limits, but is part of the problem. So that's to an anonymous attendee who asked that right off the top at 1:01 before we really even started to talk. But it was a good opportunity for me to get a riff on this question of certainty and planning. So, Eva, you want to try a question?
Yeah, sure. I'd like to go for the third one because I see that the second one is actually addressed to you.
Okay.
I'd like to talk about the tools that we use, because I see that it's also a question that came up a second time as well. So the tools that we came up with, and of course it's just one tool, is called Futures Literacy Laboratory Novelty. It's what we call an action learning, action research process, meaning that it invites two things. So it's a different approach to what we think about research and development of ideas. Why is that? It's because it's a collective intelligence knowledge creation process. So it's about making sure that we're all in a room, all talking about futures. And rather than just being in a room like what you would be at school, and we're asking you questions about what happened in 1792, for which has to be an expert. So what you'll do, you'll read more manuals, or you'll go to Wikipedia and you look for the information. The thing about futures is that not even the professor that you have in the room knows more about what's going to happen in 2035, in 2050, or in 2100. So it's, of course, this humility invitation, but it also allows us not to only think about knowledge transfer, but also to actually come up with ideas around knowledge creation. So the name of that tool being Futures Literacy Lab, what we do, we have a script, which is, because it's a progressive process, articulated around 4 phases. The first phase is around the revelation of anticipatory assumptions, meaning that whenever we think about the future, we cannot imagine things that we don't know. So what usually happens is that we will use ideas, elements that are from our past and present, and project that into the future. And the question that we ask ourselves is, what is the assumption that we make in order for that future to actually live and exist? And we want to reveal that as being part of the conversation. So this will be all about probable futures, preferred futures. What are those related to a specific theme? So for example, I was talking about the future of the consequences of slavery, but it can be things as random as the future of bread, or even the future of accessories, or even the future of clothing. That allows us to actually talk about probable preferred futures of such theme in a particular time frame. We then dive into phase 2, which is about reframing. So reframing scenario. The idea is to actually opt for scenarios of the future that are neither probable nor preferable. So to kind of challenge our approach of futures that usually are around those 2 channels, those 2 avenues, by proposing new ideas, elements that people have not thought of, basing ourselves on the anticipatory assumptions that we heard in the room in phase 1. All of those 2 phases were in the future. Then it's time for us to actually go back to the present and experience that. What are the possibilities, the potential of the present that we had not thought of, that the future actually enables us to think of? So actually using the future as a revelator of opportunities in the present, and of opportunities in the present, but also of limitations that we have in our thinking about the present. So this phase 3 is really what makes the novelty of the process really interesting. It's really those new questions that that emerge. What are the sources of value that we had overlooked that are actually maybe more relevant to today? Then we dive into a 4th phase, which is just next steps. How do we want to take it from there? So those are the tools that were developed. There's a book, Transforming the Future, Anticipation in the 21st Century, that is totally accessible online for free in English and Arabic, and soon enough in French as well.
Great, thanks, Eva. Terrific questions out here. Maybe go with the question from Jamie, since it comes at the question of power, and the question of who's framing it, and the choices we make. I think that there is undoubtedly a fundamental issue here around power, because let's think of it in a simpler context. Let's say of a child, and where a parent will play a crucial role, or the community around the child, in instilling certain fears and certain hopes. I want to be a basketball player, a soccer star. I want to be the kind of person that my parents think is a good person. These hopes and fears, they come with images of the future related to, I need a good diploma so I can get a good job. And so those kinds of frameworks, there's obviously a power relationship. We understand that parents are supposed to take care of a child, and there's a power relationship between them, a benevolent one. One might characterize it as benevolent dictatorship. But that's not where we stay, right? And so the issue here of I think of power is really quite a profound one, because it has to do with this respect and also collaboration and interdependence, and then the issue of how we can create shared meaning and shared sense together, and shared hope and shared fear. And I think we're only at the beginning of discovering non-hierarchical, non-planning based approaches to creating security and also creating collaborative interdependency that would enable the kind of diversity that I think we aspire to, in the sense of tolerance and openness and respect, but also which is on offer by the universe around us. In other words, so much of what's going on, whether it's a virus that still says knock knock, you're in my world and I'm coming in, from the virus to the most abstract ideas of human thought. This is an infoverse, and our ability to be part of it and integrated with it, and at the same time not try to dominate it, structure it, control it, is something we're barely beginning, from the point of view of dominant Western systems of power, to understand. And it goes way past the governance reform issues that are on the table, which are endogenous to existing systems. I mean, improving the multilateral system so that it has better representation and it seems more legitimate, improving the way in which elections take place, and dealing with the problem of the kind of disappearance of the intellectual strands that were represented by political parties at one point in time is obviously a major challenge. But representative systems, or even quasi-representative systems, let's say the rivalry between different factions within a party, those methods for negotiating the shared meaning, but also turning conflict not into something of mutual annihilation, but conflict into something that is an incentive for us to say, I don't need to be like you, but that doesn't mean that you can't be independent of me. And this is a kind of assemblages perspective that doesn't look at the world as hierarchical or deterministic. So the power question is a fundamental one, and I hope it's clear that I'm not offering answers. What I'm saying is that we're in a position today to begin experimenting and looking at those experiments and observing the many experiments that are taking place around us. And by nurturing and cultivating and making a strategic choice, which says our goal is not to defeat or somehow imprison the novel, emergent, potential rival, not to wipe out things that are born, because those things that are born might one day grow up and be big and make me smaller. It's not to take that attitude. It's to take the other strategic choice towards emergence and novelty, which is one of cultivation, of nurturing, of interchange, of humility, as Eva has already said, and opening up an alternative perspective that's radically different. It's been explored in some literature. It's been explored in some discussions. Ursula Le Guin was one of the people who explored that kind of topic, that says, what if we really moved away from the current way of dealing with power? So, I mean, that's to me a central question. And I hope that we have the, in some sense, the motivation in the context of a pandemic to search deeply into the roots of the way power gets constructed and reproduced. I'll tell you, the thing that I fear the most, and in that sense, it's relatively commonplace, but I mean, it's the inertia and the ability of existing systems to reproduce themselves. And I think human volition has a relatively limited capacity, leverage, importance in shifting the systems. But I think that there are ways for us to try and make some choices that alter the conditions in which we live, so change in the conditions of change. And hopefully that's what we're doing here. Eva, you want to go for another question?
I would. I'd like to actually address, before diving into the question on time, which is something that I'd be very keen to explore a little bit more, I'd like to talk about complexity because this question was also made recurrent. And by doing so, I'm actually not going to talk about futures directly, but it will explain part of my interest in futures, which is legal systems in Africa as an example of complexity. So in most of the post-colonial worlds, we have different legal cultures. We usually apply, for example, the fruit of colonization, so maybe British common law or French civil law. And we also apply customary law that are the transcription of our norms as applied prior to the arrival of colonizers in our respective countries. Sometimes we also have religious norms that are also applicable, meaning that you have a full patchwork of different norms that are applied to the same people, and sometimes in this on the same legal issues at stake, maybe marriages, inheritance, or land law. In this particular case, what was thought of right after the independence was usually to say that over time, people will just dive into one specific cultural norm, and bear in mind that it was most probably going to be the most structured legal norms that were applied in the West, so British common law in Anglophone countries, or French civil law in Francophone countries, just to talk about those two specific situations, even though there's others. And 60, 70, 80 years after the independence, we tend to observe that those other norms are still applicable, are still there. May be customary norms, may be Hindu law, may be Islamic law that are still applicable in those circumstances. Some people are just saying it's because we're too slow and we should actually, catch up to the West and actually apply their norms. And another avenue is actually to say, hey, wait a minute. There's actually a proof of complexity here, that norms that people navigate around. And this issue of navigating around norms is not only a matter that should be interesting to jurists that are interested in how we apply norms, why we apply norms, how can we draft norms better in order for people to actually understand them better and apply them better. It's also an entire issue around this idea that, oh, wait a minute, here it's not as simple as I thought it was. It doesn't mean that it's complicated, but it means that there's knots that are actually intertwined. And that's when we dive into a conversation around the notion of complexity. And the dynamism of those concepts is actually something that would be more keen to explore. So how can we, in our understanding of anticipation, embrace a more holistic and much more like complex framework in order to think about the future differently? I think there's two things that we should bear in mind. Of course, taking that step back, but also maybe prevent our automatic response towards agency that is structured around this idea of doing things. Meaning, maybe it's not just, oh, it's so evident because we've been doing it all this time, it's got to work, which is usually the type of technology-driven kind of solutions that we come up with whenever we face a particular solution. But actually understanding why there's hybrids, how do we navigate, how do we surf around those waves of complexity? And that's, I believe, part of the answer, really this kind of intellectual game that we play that has economics, social, cultural, political consequences.
Great, thank you, Eva. That's terrific, and it plays into a lot of the other questions that are on the list here. But let me go to Daniel. I'll read the question. Is narrow-mindedness a sign for complexity, or is it an indicator for a mindset that cannot acknowledge complexity? And how can we induce different mindsets of more flexible, open-ended, open system thinking? Well, I guess, the thing, and I think it's the point that Eva's evoking there with respect to norms. These are emergent phenomena, and there's the thing is that if we cast ourselves in the position of agents that must change mindsets in order to change the world, I think we end up creating much of the same problem that we have today. I would take the example, and it's an example which I think is actually very fundamental and gives us many different ways of understanding the challenge of anticipation and anticipatory systems, which has to do with literacy and learning to read and write. When people learn to read and write, we absolutely don't know what they're going to do with it. And there's going to be a huge diversity of uses. I mean, some people will learn to read and write, and they'll use it to read street signs and newspaper ads and classified advertising and warnings on packages, but they won't use it for much else. Other people will write treatises or literature or whatever. And I think that that's one of the critical things here, is that once enabled, people can appreciate it from where they stand and from where they are at. And with respect to understanding anticipatory systems, the thing that I find so powerful about a competency-based approach is that it opens us up to appreciating things that are there, because these are emergent phenomena, novel, so different, or continuity, the same, repetition, but making sense of them and sensing them and inventing. And, you know, there's two pieces to this kind of sense that I have that I want to share, which is, on the one hand, if I look at where human volition has made a difference along the lines of what I'm talking about, I would say reading and writing is the big one. I mean, what else have we done for all of humanity, more or less? I know that there are many people who still can't read and write, and still many people outside of school, but we made a decision, humanity in general, that everybody should learn to read and write. And that essentially changed the conditions of change in a competency-based way, because we knew perfectly well, and in fact, it was one of the criticisms of universal compulsory schooling initially, say, why do these people need to learn to read and write? Why should they have access to this information? Why should they be empowered in that way? And arguably, that empowerment that took place with reading and writing has fundamentally enabled us to do much of what we've done over the last 300 years, some of it terribly destructive, obviously, which is just to show you that competency does not necessarily lead us to good futures. So that's the second point, which is, instead of being so teleological, instead of being so oriented towards creating better futures and knowing the future so that we can make our children safe and happy, to be more humble, but also to be more in the present. And to think of the capacity, which is futures literacy, that allows us to appreciate both novelty and difference. In other words, both transformative and adaptive and continuity. To be able to appreciate all that in such a way that we say our contribution is to be inventive, to be creative, to be open, to recognize, to share, to project, to make bets, but at the same time to make bets with also a sense of patience and also a sense of the limited nature and dangerous nature of those bets, which can be something that lock people in to rigid, defensive, closed ways of being. So this is like all paradigmatic changes, flat earth, round earth, these kinds of things. Moving through some transition phase is going to be hugely creative, very provocative, because it's incomprehensible initially in terms of the paradigmatic contrast. The monsters are not the same. The hopes are not the same. People who hope for a great leader. Well, the kind of power relationships and anticipatory systems that I'm talking about, there won't be any great leaders. We might tell the story about somebody who was really lucky and invented a cell phone that everybody wanted to buy because they happened to be in the right place at the right time for the convergence of a complex system. But we won't think that there's some sort of miraculous hero, because hundreds of people thought of it other than that person. And they just weren't in the right place at the right time with the right resources. We will alter the way we tell our story about humanity. And in that way, we really move beyond the existing paradigm. But for now, that's very uncomfortable, very frightening, because people want some paternal protection. They want that leadership. They think that they can be saved and they can be safe. And I think ultimately that makes us certainly less resilient. And it's something we will struggle with for quite some time. And maybe we won't succeed. Maybe we will. Eva?
Cool. No, I agree with this approach, which also questions our relationship with or our understanding of evaluation, what we believe, what we consider to be successful. And I did read a question on that, so maybe I would dive into answering this one. But actually, I leave it to you, and I'll go to time because this question has been pending for quite some time. I'm reading the question out loud. How can we use different conceptions of time in foresight activities in Western context? I'm asking this from a very practical sense. Conception of time is quite fundamental in how we make sense of our world. Tips on this, also tools for shifting time conceptions. My first answer on that would be to say that anticipatory assumptions are not things that are bad to have. I mean, we always do, and that's why when talking about how we imagine, we always talk about this idea that we need to assume things in order to move forward. So the fact that in the Western world has evolved around this very linear approach to time is not bad per se. It's more about realizing that it's there, because once you realize that it's there, you realize how it conditions other things. For example, there was an interesting essay that I would recommend for anyone to read, which is Redskins White Mask, for which Riel knows that I'm pretty fond of this essay. But in this essay, there's an invitation on the ontological differences between Native Americans and the Canadian state. And in that sense, he was pointing out the fact that development is actually a pretty linear process. So there's this idea that you actually progress over time, that you advance. Even all of the words that I use are connotated with this idea of moving forward. So always in a straight line. Now, Native Americans, actually, at least that's what Coulthard argues, are actually much more interested in this approach to space, this approach to land, and land not just as being the soil or the earth, but actually also land as a source of relationship. And this difference in understanding, this ontological difference, actually explained why it was difficult for Native Americans and the Canadian state to actually engage in a meaningful conversation, because they were not talking about the same thing. One was talking about time, while the other one was talking about space. And so embracing those different conceptions of time were actually interesting, not only from an intellectual viewpoint, but also in order to make sure that we can actually engage in a conversation where there's shared meanings. And that's what conversations around the futures are about. Discussing shared meanings and actually building and creating meaning together. So in that sense, when it comes to engage in different conceptions of time in our futures activities, we're more than open to actually, for example, in the reframing scenario of a Futures Literacy Lab, we could definitely talk about and invite that conversation using different tools such as tales or stories that actually allows us to actually talk about time differently. For example, just the anecdote that I've shared with you. Or we could also just render this very linear approach to time explicit. And by doing so, inviting people to actually think about the consequences of those anticipatory assumptions. And that's what also being future literate is about.
Great, Eva, thanks. So I'll switch over to another question. This one was an anonymous one, but why do you think anticipatory thinking is key for current global challenges for sustainable development, and how this affects or requests capacity building for different stakeholders, particularly in the private sector and governments? I mean, the sustainable development goals and the global challenges and the idea that we want to solve challenges does reside pretty squarely in kind of the the what I would call the old paradigm. Not that it's not important. It is important, and of course, it's crucial for us to be able to enhance capacity for existing institutions, which includes governments and businesses as they exist today. But what we can do at the same time, I think, is find ways of entering into a conversation around the nature of the problems and the nature of the opportunities that loosens up the grip of the past trajectory of the advanced so-called Western nations. In other words, the image of the city as London, New York, Tokyo, Shanghai, Dubai, etc., the image of the economy as Silicon Valley or as the City of London, those images are hugely powerful, and they imply a certain way of thinking about catch-up and convergence. And no one is, I think, unhappy with improvements in traffic flow, in water quality, and in improving the way life is lived in a city. But what we see right now with the pandemic and the fact that we stopped so many of those aspects of our mobility, which then impeded so many aspects of the way we work, the way we socialize, the way we eat, the way we entertain ourselves, is that we can be really invited to rethink what was the relationship of standing in the metro in a crowd to my well-being. What was the relationship of being in an office around the water cooler to my understanding of constructed social relationships? Why do we think of a sense of continuity and security in a way that sets us up for the crisis attitude of panic and fear when the shocks that are part of our universe occur? That's where the word improvisation comes in the title to the talk here, is that our current systems, in some senses, almost denigrate spontaneity and improvisation. You should be planned, prepared. You should not be surprised. If you're surprised, you're not a good technocrat, you're not a good leader, you've failed. But that prohibits, it fundamentally excludes experimentation and risk-taking, and it excludes conceptualizing things outside the existing framework, even inventing new language. Why are you using that strange word? Find the right word and tell me what it is. In other words, this is all part of I think, even the word development, and as Eva was saying, how difficult it is. The word time and forward and progress and all catch up. All our language is of course what we have to use to share ideas with each other to describe imaginary futures or present conditions and the past. But those words are hugely limiting. So one of the things I think that's also important here about improvisation is that when you tune into when you're improvising, you're taking a lot of input. You're not just taking the notes or the choreography of the choreographer. You're actually feeling the moment. You're taking the entire spectrum of things that you can absorb, and you're using that as inspiration, and you're allowing yourself to let go and to flow. Of course, improvisation and spontaneity have tremendous underlying preconditions related to understanding, being able to control your body, if we talk about dance improvisation, or understand music, if you're talking about musical improvisation. But the ability to combine both, and in that way, really open ourselves up to the wonder, the mystery, and the continuous surprises of our universe seems to me to be essential if we are to be resilient. Because resilience, on the basis of the current resilience strategy, I think is destined who knows what will happen, but destined to fail, because it's essentially a defensive, making a single bet on a structured planning, command and control approach. Whereas if we open up and we take this dual perspective on anticipation for the future and anticipation for emergence, and we are able to entertain both, including the not doing, which is not passivity, but is patience and awareness and appreciation and learning that Eva mentioned. That, it seems to me, opens up the potential for a diversification approach to resilience. And as we know, diversification, in which some will die, things will end, but new things will be born, provides a much stronger foundation for resilience through the processes of space and time. Eva, another one?
Yes. I'll go for one of those questions around agency and politics in general. And so how we engage, how do we make sure that, you know, the higher up can actually take that conversation to the next level? So I'm thinking about this question. I think people do sense the space of opportunity that we face with the pandemic. However, in the US context, I have peers that feel the political system, barely dropping out, has failed them. And so how do we engage people in this new space of possibility? Or are you bullish for change despite what appears to be politics as usual? What do you bring from international change or context about how to make change without leadership buy-in? This is a good one, and I really don't know how to start with this one. So what I'll do is I'll provide you with an example of a lab I was in with young people, because usually there's also a demand to actually make sure that when we talk about futures, that the younger generations are actually represented, because it's supposed to be, hopefully, their future. What I tend to observe in those, so I explained a little bit about the structure, so I'll just briefly go through that again. Phase 1, reveal. We go through probable preferred futures, and then we reveal what kind of anticipatory assumptions we have. Phase 2, reframing scenario. We go for a scenario that is neither probable nor preferable in order to challenge us a little bit into imagining and creating together potential futures. Phase 3, new questions. What did phase 1 and phase 2 bring to our thinking? How do we think about the present differently? In this kind of circumstances, what we tend to observe is that phase 1 is pretty much our comfort zone, because probable futures are based on trends, on statistics, things that we've experienced, things that we've seen. So we can actually bet on that future and the fact that it's going to happen. Even though in 2019, if I had asked people how they would have believed they would have spent their the April 2020, they probably would not have thought that it would be spending it in their own home for a few weeks. But never mind. In that kind of circumstances, what I tend to hear in the room is participants talking about what they are supposed to do in the future, maybe in their probable future or in their preferred futures. For example, in one of the labs that I had at UNESCO, some of the participants who were very UN driven were telling us about how it was important for the UN system to make sure that peace happens in 2050. So there was this idea of waiting for those institutions or those other people to take care of good things for them. Now, what I like about the structure of this tool is actually the invitation that is much more individual and collective at the same time, but collective not necessarily engaging the city or the state, but actually engaging the group that you're in terms of thinking about next steps based on your understanding of the way you use the future. And so in that sense, the first realization in this type of context is, of course, the powerlessness that we have in the power structure that we are in, but also the great source of knowledge and empowerment that comes from the group that you're in, discussing about futures, because here you realize, hey, come on, there's things that I actually can bring in. I have an understanding of the world that I can put forward on the table and that can be listened to. And this first step towards empowerment is something that futures help us do. So in that sense, I do believe that futures literacy is actually a skill that is not only a matter of big agendas. Of course, it's important for it to be mentioned in those type of agendas, and that's part of our role here, coming from UNESCO, to also make sure that those discussions are taken to the next level. But it's also about making sure that every single one of you also realize that they have something to bring on the table.
Great, Eva. Thank you. I think we're pretty much at the end here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try the question on how should we incorporate futures literacy into shaping today's practices. How can we change social practices like working from the office, working from the home, and potential futures informed practices. I think that this practical level is just what Eva was talking about there, and I think that it's one of the aspects of the topic we've been addressing, which is how do people begin to learn about a particular topic. And I think that you know, the motivation in general, it's one of the things that the futures community is able to take advantage of, is that people are interested in the future in general. And in the current context, people are, you know, interested for many reasons and highly motivated. And there, the challenge in practice is to get them to pay attention, not to a bunch of scenarios, because scenarios are a dime a dozen. You can get, you know, every 2 minutes you can generate a new set of scenarios, and you can contradict the one you just generated. It's really to say, are you noticing something different? Because your sense of the future is in fact really super fuzzy, really opaque. And for me, this is kind of like an object lesson in a futures literacy process that we talk about in futures literacy laboratories, which are just the kind of epistemological side of a bigger ontological picture around understanding the future as anticipatory systems. But in that methodological side, here's an opportunity, wow, to say, you've given up on this idea of the future you used to have. What are you seeing that you didn't see before? And instead of being preoccupied with the future as the future, to use this kind of fog to say, what are you noticing around you now that you're not fixated on your next job or on your commute or on, you know, how to fix the problem of carbon pollution from building steel and concrete buildings. In other words, instead of fixing the existing system, because the existing system's kind of been stopped for the moment, stop worrying about it. And use this opportunity precisely to think about different working practices, different ways of using information technology that we all have more or less at our disposal, and that way taking this as a real moment for creativity. And for me, that's the exciting and kind of inspiring side of what's going on. I want to thank everybody for hanging in and for all the great questions. Sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all of them.
We could actually say that we can continue this conversation on LinkedIn, for example, and actually set a trend. What do you think about it?
Sure. Let's get the questions after the session. I'm sure that our colleagues can provide the questions coming off of Zoom, and we can remain in contact with those who've given their details. This is about building bigger communities and taking advantage of the serendipity. So thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a good one. And thanks again for the organization also.
Yeah. Bye-bye.